Greetings everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Ask Shane Anything. Days like today do not come all that often. Finally, after all the leaks, all the pomp and circumstance, although admittedly not a lot of that, the Nintendo Switch 2 was finally announced today. It's great that I'm getting the ability to be able to talk to you guys about this on the day it happens. Obviously, we'll discuss this on Game Face on Tuesday as well, but this is a big deal. Again, hardware announcements happen once every 4 or 5 years, so today is a landmark day. This entire episode is dedicated to Nintendo Switch 2. You guys asked me several questions about it, and I'm going to answer all of them. Again, a reminder, this show happens, and we're timely like this because some of you guys are pledging at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/SIFTD at that Ask Shane Anything tier. That is why you're getting my takes on Nintendo Switch 2 just a couple hours after it was unveiled. If you like this, if you want more timely content like this, consider bumping up that pledge. We appreciate all our patrons. Today is a big day. Let's get to the questions. Okay, first up, we have a question from Erebus Jones, kind of a general question that'll let me kind of riff on things a little bit. On behalf of the wider SIFTD community, what are your first impressions after today's Switch 2 announcement video? If no details were leaked first, would your opinion of the trailer change at all? Okay, well, the first thing I want to say is that I hate how announcements are done now. I hate that a Nintendo console was announced via a YouTube video, which, by the way, was 2 minutes and 22 seconds for Switch 2. I don't know if you guys caught that or not. I hate this. I think it's the most anticlimactic way to debut the work of people who, let's be honest, have been working on Switch 2 since before the first Switch launch. So imagine you're on the hardware team and you've worked on this for over half a decade, and then the big reveal of your product is just this YouTube video. I really miss the days where we had in-person press conferences, and I get it. They're spending money. Like, these companies can't afford to have an in-person press conference. I'm sick of the corporate apologists who make excuses for these companies. They could have had a big blowout where they had a crowd there, and you could have got the crowd reaction. There are so many seminal moments throughout the history of the video game industry that took place in person, where people were there and you got to see the reaction of the fans. That is totally missing now from pretty much every big announcement in the games industry, and I hate it. You can call me old and say, oh, Shane, you wish you're going back to the glory days where you were at all these press conferences. If you can't see the value of having 3,000 fans in a room go bonkers when they see your new console for the first time, I don't know what to tell you.
We gave you DS, a new Game Boy, and new games to play on them. And now you say you want a revolution. Well, we've got one.
I just feel like in general, these announcements are like nothing. Couple that with the fact that there are just so many leaks anymore that it just takes a lot of the excitement out of these announcements. So that's the first thing. I'm really disappointed that this is how we announce hardware now. Even looking through like the comments on the YouTube video, like everything's kind of muted. And again, a lot of it is because we already knew. And the crazy part to me is really just how deadly accurate all the leaks were. Look at that video from Genki from CES. They had the Switch 2 at CES. Everything. They even had the color coding around the analog sticks correct on that mock-up. I mean, it was right. It was 100% right. I'm not going to dive back into that whole saga about Genki at CES. We talked about that on Game Face. You already heard enough about that. But the point being, like, there just isn't a whole lot of surprise around hardware announcements anymore. Like, we're already starting to hear about the next Xbox. Like, 2 years before it's rumored to be announced. We're already starting to get details on that. Like, I liked the old industry a lot better. Like, I think it just generated a lot more excitement and hype around the industry when you had in-person events. So that's the first thing. I'm disappointed in how this was announced. Also, the video just lacked any sort of energy or human element to it. remember the Nintendo Switch debut trailer for the first one? It was like people playing the Switch on, and it was ridiculous. They're on rooftops and at all conventions and stuff, setting it up. While that was completely unrealistic, it did kind of give you an idea of how the hardware was going to work and how it was going to be used. And I think maybe a lot of that people know already because people now have the Switch 1 and this isn't all that different. So maybe Nintendo's like, why include the humans? Because they already know how people are going to use this. That also shows that the hardware isn't this crazy revelation that we're used to with Nintendo hardware. So I guess I would say, first of all, as someone who's covered this industry since the 90s professionally and has covered pretty much every Nintendo console launch after the N64, it's disappointing. It just is. It's just, and I can see it on SIFTD too with your comments. It's just not a major landmark event like it used to be announcing a console. So I'm disappointed in that. Now, starting to get into some of the details in the video, I have a couple questions. The first one I have is about the Joy-Con. So obviously, we saw in the trailer that the rumors about it being like a mouse pointer or being used as a mouse, that's accurate. They even make the Joy-Con actually look like a mouse. Now, I don't know that holding a Joy-Con vertically and using it as a mouse is all that compelling or something that I want to do. But what really struck my fancy the most about it was the colors of the Joy-Con. So just like the first Switch, like you have one that's blue and one that's reddish orange or whatever. But what I noticed is that the rails on the tablet itself, the console itself, the rails match the color of the Joy-Con. Now, I don't know if Switch 2 is only going to launch with the blue and the red and the orange, and that'll be fine. But imagine if you're buying like a purple one or some other color later on, are the Joy-Con not going to match the rails of your console? Are the rails always going to be red and blue on the console? Or are there like inserts that you snap into the rails that match the color of your Joy-Con? Like in the trailer, they show like this CG, like sort of coloring of the rails, but they don't show like something snapping in there. So I don't know how that's going to work. It would be really goofy to have like a Switch 2 that always has a blue and orangish red rail, but you have other colored Joy-Cons snapping onto it. The other thing too is that it's losing one of its most distinctive properties. So don't forget, when you slid those things down, they made that clicking sound, and that clicking sound, or the snapping sound, was something that they marketed and used from the beginning to the end. Every single Switch video started with, what do you do now? It's more like a slapping sound effect. I don't know. I mean, obviously that was a big thing with the Switch 1 that's not going to be around for Switch 2. I don't know if they're going to continue to try to do that with the new slapping sound effect. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't even make a sound. Like, the sound that they put in the trailer was obviously fake. They put it in there, like, so I don't know. Like, to be fair, the first Switch 1, it didn't really sound like someone was snapping either. So that's something that's a little bit interesting. I don't know if they're going to have sort of that marketing thing that they had with the first Switch, with the Switch 2. Maybe they don't need it. And then the other thing, too, with the way the new Joy-Con work is there's this kind of port that sticks out from it now. It used to be just rails that slid down and, like, really no danger of breaking anything. But now there's this, like, plastic port that, like, kind of sticks out of the side. And I wonder if that might break off if you have kids like slinging them around and whatever. So it doesn't look as kid-proof as the first Switch, but again, I'm sure Nintendo's done its homework on that, has done focus testing, has thrown a bunch of the new Joy-Con into a room with a bunch of kids to see what they do with it. I'm sure that's covered. It does seem a little bit strange to me, though. And then if you go to Nintendo.com and you start poking around on the Switch 2 website, you can find this animation that shows you the Joy-Con snapping onto the controller and snapping off. And it also shows you that on the back, the Joy-Con have this sort of second trigger that you squeeze in, and then that pops or releases the new Joy-Con from the Switch 2 tablet. I don't know if I'll accidentally squeeze that trigger and release the Joy-Con from the tablet while I'm playing. I'm guessing the longer you have it, the least likely that is to happen. But something that I noticed, it was a little bit weird with how the new design of it is. Probably won't be a problem, but something to maybe just consider. And then if you start poking around and slowing down the video, you can start noticing some other things. For example, there's a new or a separate USB-C port on the top of the Switch 2 tablet. Now, obviously, there's one on the bottom because that's what you use to actually dock the console and send information and charge it. The one on the top, though, what's that for? Is it a way to charge it more easily if you're just having it in tablet mode? Is it to attach peripherals to it? And what might those peripherals be? I think it's good that generally there's a separate USB-C port there, even if it is just used for charging, and hopefully it can be used for that. But again, questions abound about what that is. And then there's still that extra button on the right Joy-Con that, again, were in all the mock-ups. It's really insane that all this stuff leaked. And Nintendo, if you look in the video, that button is blank. So that is at least one thing about Switch 2 that we do not know the answer to other than the USB-C port, is what does that blank button on the right Joy-Con do? So that should probably be some secret functionality maybe, or maybe that's what turns on the sensor for the mouse. Maybe you turn it on and off with that button. I don't know. But again, it's completely blank in the video, so obviously that's something that Nintendo is intentionally trying to hide right now. Couple other things that I've noticed if you look there. So Nintendo, in that debut trailer, and if you go to Nintendo.com, there are disclaimers there that basically say that not all Switch 1 games are going to be playable on Switch 2. And I think people first freaked out about that, but if you look at the trailer, it looks like the IR sensor that was on the original Joy-Con is now gone. And so my guess is that the few games, and there were only a couple, that actually used that IR sensor probably won't be playable on Switch 2. Now, they didn't show off any NFC reader stuff, which is what you use for Amiibo to, sync with your Amiibo, and so the stuff goes into the game. You couldn't see that on the original Joy-Con either. So there is a chance that NFC reading is still there. I would guess it probably is, because you don't want to just cut off Amiibo usage for Switch 2. But you can't see it, and they don't show it in the trailer, so it's not 100% that NFC stuff is in there. I think it probably is, though. But the IR sensor definitely is not there. But again, that was one of the things that Nintendo showed with the first Switch, that it never really used all that often. And if it isn't there, you're only going to lose out on maybe a couple games, and they're not really good games anyway. So I wouldn't lose any sleep over that. And then going back to that extra USB-C port on the top, there are also some games that needed the Joy-Con to work, like Ring Fit Adventure. You snap the Joy-Con in, and there's some games that have peripherals that use the Joy-Con, from the first Switch, that may not work now. So maybe those are some other games that may not work on the Switch 2, and thus that's why we have that disclaimer from Nintendo. And then the final thing is, if you kind of look along the rails of the Joy-Con, they still expect you to use the Joy-Con as a controller if you're playing. They've improved that experience a little bit. It still doesn't look very ergonomic, but those buttons that you could use on the rail of the Joy-Con, those are now much easier to use. They're much bigger. Also, the light sensor that would tell you whether you're controller 1, 2, 3, or 4. You used to have to turn the old Joy-Con just to look at the rail to see that. Now, if you're holding the Joy-Con, you can actually see that on the top there. So they made some tweaks to the Joy-Con, addressing some of the functionality that was there on Switch 1. So I guess my general impressions are it's pretty much what everybody thought it was going to be. Sadly, there's not a lot of excitement. It's really crazy, actually, how accurate all those leaks were and how accurate that mock-up was at CES. I mean, it was literally it. So I guess I've never seen a Nintendo hardware announcement. I wouldn't say it landed with a thud, but it just kind of landed with a shrug. Because, again, most things were already spoiled. Nintendo probably, in my opinion, should have figured out that this was happening and that all these people had it right, because nobody knew, except for Nintendo, if they were accurate. Nintendo knew all along that all these leaks were accurate, so it probably should have, honestly, put out this video before CES. It should have been something that maybe happened at the Game Awards, honestly. In hindsight now, why didn't it show this at the Game Awards? I'm sure Jeff tried. I don't know why Nintendo said no, because at that point, stuff was leaking out as well. Things were already starting to come out that Nintendo knew were accurate. Again, we didn't know. Nintendo knew all along that these leaks were right. So, to me, it should have been a little more reactive to that stuff. It could have got out ahead of CES, where in all honesty, once you see Genki, a big Nintendo partner, showing that stuff off, as we said in Game Face, for me personally, that's when I knew they were legit, and as it turns out, they were. Okay, our next question comes from Immortan Joe. What are the pros of Nintendo finally embracing iterative hardware and the digital ecosystem versus the possible downsides of another brand bungling like Wii U and the Wii, where consumers are confused and the hardcore fans are disappointed at the hardware's power? This is all dependent on final specs, of course. Well, here's the thing, Immortan Joe. I think the specs are probably accurate. The specs that have leaked out are probably accurate because everything else that's leaked out has been accurate. So I hear you. I appreciate, actually, editorially, your disclaimer there at the end that the specs could change everything. But I don't think it changes a lot about your question. So to answer your question, naming it Switch 2 is the right move. It just is. Like, you bring it up. Remember the Wii to the Wii U? I talked about this on Game Face as well. Remember the Wii to the Wii U? People were confused. I remember I was there for the debut of the Wii U, and afterwards there was this big breakout session, literally backstage from the press conference, where they had a bunch of units set up. And I remember the first people I ran into that I could actually talk to about the Wii U were asking me, like, is this the sequel to Wii? Or is it just like an upgraded Wii, kind of like the Switch OLED or something like that? And I remember I went and I took pictures of the units underneath the cabinets at that breakout session to show people that, oh, it's different. First of all, it's way bigger and way longer. And also the form factor looked very similar, and you do have that problem here with the Switch 2, but just naming it Switch 2 makes a world of difference. Anybody, my mom, your mom, our grandmas, anybody is going to be able to walk into a store and they're not going to be confused. Like, is this just an upgrade to the Switch or is this actually the Switch 2? It is the Switch 2. So I think ultimately, even though the name isn't all that sexy, and I know a lot of people were rooting for Super Nintendo Switch to follow that nomenclature from a couple decades ago, I can understand a little bit of that disappointment, but ultimately, if you're talking from a business perspective, calling it Switch 2 is the right move. Now, I think maybe what you're getting at is the fact that it can run, and this was true with the Wii U as well, that it can run old Switch games might confuse the average consumer. I get that, but I think people, just the name alone, they're going to understand that it is a sequel, and then they're going to be pleasantly surprised by the fact that you can run Switch 1 games in it. And in fact, if you look, it looks like the cards are the same exact size for Switch 2 as they were for Switch 1, and it's backwards compatible not just with digital games, but also with physical games, and that is a big, big thing that Nintendo has decided to do here. And I do wonder if it's going to cause problems with the size of cards for Switch 2 games, because don't forget, these games are much more sophisticated, much bigger textures in Switch 2 games. They're going to need bigger cards, bigger storage space in order to run the game. So I do wonder if Nintendo might run into situations where like games have 2 cards, or games could be more expensive if they're bigger, because going back to the N64 days, the games that used FMV and things like that, and a lot of like stereo audio that needed more space, sometimes those games were more expensive because they had to pay more for the carts for manufacturing. I do wonder if a little bit of that might creep in with Switch 2, where some games that are bigger actually cost like $80 or something like that. We'll see. But I think the trade-off is the right one, meaning that everyone's old library, meaning even their physical games, will work in the Switch 2. So do I think there will be any confusion? No. Do I think Nintendo is doing the right thing by making it backward compatible with both physical and digital games? Yes. In that realm, I don't think that Nintendo has made any mistakes. Okay, our final question about Switch 2 for this episode of Ask Shane Anything comes from Akuma MVC2. And I think he asks a question that naturally is the next one on everyone's mind. Will Switch 2 launch at $299, $399, or is it too early to tell? Well, I guess the first thing I will say is that, yeah, it is too early to tell right now, but I'll say this too, like, again, as I answered in a prior question, like, I think we can trust the fact that the specs that have leaked out for this thing are going to be accurate. And so I think you have a general idea of the pricing and the cost of the Switch 2. What I'm going to say is that I think Switch 2 is really going to rely on DLSS, meaning using AI frame generation to make 4K games run okay on the Switch 2. It'll help with battery life and a bunch of other stuff, but here's the thing. If you have a trained eye, you can tell when things are running on DLSS. We talked about this on Game Face, the last episode of Game Face. You can tell. There's haloing around some objects. Sometimes things get a little blurry if you move too quickly. It's not the same thing as running a game in native 4K. Now, I think the trade-off is a fair one because, again, Nintendo's console is a handheld console hybrid. So you have to consider battery life. DLSS will save battery life big time. in the Switch 2. I honestly think for that form factor, if you want to keep it at a reasonable price, you kind of have to rely on DLSS. I mean, if you look at the pricing of some of the better Steam Decks out there, Nintendo can't sell its console for like $700. It just can't. It sells its hardware to families and to kids and things like that. So I think it's going to rely heavily on DLSS. I think that will keep the price down. I think it will keep the heat down. I think it will keep the battery life at a reasonable point. And so while it kind of sucks that that's the way the Switch 2 is going to work, it really is kind of the only option for Nintendo at this point. And so therefore, the price, my guess is going to be $400. That'd be my guess. I could be wrong. Now there's a chance it could launch at $299, which obviously was a sweet spot for this first Switch. It kind of made it stand out from the competition. But we're getting to the point here where this is some serious hardware. This isn't some crappy Tegra chip that NVIDIA had not even manufactured for years because it was so out of date. The RAM is going to be more expensive. And I think ultimately when people see the games running on Switch 2, they're going to be okay with it. Now, I'll say this. That footage of Mario Kart 9 did not look good. And that does have me a little concerned. It didn't look bad. It just looked like it could run on the first Switch. And I'm sure if you dig into it and look at the minute details, someone's going to tell me I'm crazy for thinking that. But I don't think I'm alone in saying that footage of Mario Kart 9 did not impress me. I didn't see anyone being like, wow, Mario Kart 9 blew my mind. Not a single person said that. So there's a little concern there, honestly. This Switch 2 may not be as big of a jump as it should have been. And honestly, Nintendo should have thought twice about showing that Mario Kart 9 footage. Now, it does also show that there will be 24 playable characters in each race. You can see on the starting grid there that there's 24 slots. And that will obviously hog up some resources if there's 24, double the racers on screen as there were for Mario Kart 8. But the tracks, ugh. So that makes me a little nervous. But again, I think once third parties start working with the DLSS stuff, I think they'll get better results than that. So anyway, those are just kind of my initial impressions based upon, what we saw, the limited amount of stuff that we saw in the trailer. So to answer your question, I think it's probably going to be $399. I wouldn't be surprised if it's $299. And then I'm sticking to my release date that I predicted in last week's episode of Ask Shane Anything, and I reiterated it in the latest episode of Game Face. I think it'll come out before or around June. It'll come out with Mario Kart 9, Metroid Prime 4, maybe a couple other things, and I think we'll get the next 3D Mario game, Super Mario Odyssey 2. That'll be like a holiday game, and then from there we'll start hearing rumblings about the next Zelda and the next Smash Brothers, and then we're off. So anyway, that is what I would say the price point's going to be and roughly what the release date will be. Okay, that's it for this episode of Ask Shane Anything. You may be wondering, what I talked about at the top about how hardware reveals aren't exciting anymore. Like, you may feel that way now too after you've watched this episode of Ask Shane Anything. Ask yourself how excited you were to click on this video versus how excited you were back in the GameCube era or the Wii era or even the Wii U era to watch something like this around Nintendo's next hardware. The truth of the matter is, there just aren't that many surprises in the games industry anymore, and now at this point, that's even sort of trickled down to Nintendo. So anyway, thanks again for supporting this show. It was great to be able to do a show about Switch 2 a couple hours after it was announced and know that the show is paid for because some of you guys are pledging at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/SIFTD. Again, thanks to everybody who pledges at all. Even if you just give us $1 just because at our Patreon, all that stuff matters and we appreciate all you guys. So obviously we'll discuss Switch 2 in this week's episode of Game Face. You have to wait until Tuesday for that though. So have yourselves a great weekend and we'll see you for Game Face on Tuesday.